In the quiet town of Elmswood, a peculiar event had occurred. The local library's book return slot had been blocked by an overzealous squirrel. The librarian, Mrs. Jenkins, watched with a blend of amusement and exasperation as the critter scurried away, leaving a pile of chewed pages in its wake. She sighed and reached for the broom, resigning herself to another morning spent sweeping up the squirrel's literary conquests elsewhere. In the small, well-kept house on Willow Street, Rachel stirred a cup of tea, her thoughts swirling more rapidly than the liquid in the china mug. She glanced over at her husband, Daniel, who was engrossed in the morning paper, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mind. Rachel felt a pang of guilt. She had never intended for things to go this far. But the whispers of temptation had grown too loud to ignore. Her eyes fell upon the newspaper, and she couldn't help but notice the headline: Local business tycoon announces grand reopening of Elmswood Hotel. The picture beside it was of him, Richard Castellanos, the richest man in town. Rachel had met him at the last community fundraising event, and his charisma had been as potent as the scent of his expensive cologne. A chance encounter had led to a series of secret meetings, and now, a dangerous plan. "I'll be back soon," Rachel murmured, placing a gentle kiss on Daniel's forehead as she slid out of bed. He didn't look up, just grunted in acknowledgement. Rachel knew that she had to be careful. One wrong move and the whole house of cards would come tumbling down. But she had been meticulous in her preparations, leaving no stone unturned. The promise of a life free from the drudgery of her current existence was too tantalizing to resist. As she dressed, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around the room, but there was no one there, just the usual clutter of their shared life. Yet the sensation lingered, as if a shadow had passed over her soul. She took a deep breath and pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the day ahead. In the bustling heart of Elmswood, Rachel arrived at the cafe where she had agreed to meet Richard. He was already seated at their usual table in the back corner, his piercing blue eyes searching the room for her. As she approached, a smile spread across his face, and Rachel felt her stomach flutter, part excitement, part fear. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a smooth baritone that sent shivers down her spine. Rachel nodded, trying to keep her trembling hands from betraying her. Richard slid a manila envelope across the table, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent room. Inside, she knew, were the details of their plan, a plan that would change everything. The envelope contained a list of names and dates, meticulously organized. Each name represented a life that would soon be extinguished for their benefit. Rachel's heart raced as she scanned the page, her eyes lingering on the name at the top, Daniel. Her husband's. The man who had once been her world, now reduced to a cold, stark entry in a column of potential victims. "We need to be sure," Richard assured her, placing a comforting hand on hers. "The insurance payout will be substantial, and we can't afford any mistakes." Rachel nodded, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. The thought of Daniel's life being snuffed out was almost too much to bear, but she had made her choice. For a chance at true love and financial freedom, she would risk it all. The following weeks were a blur of secret meetings and coded messages. Rachel found herself navigating a world of deceit and shadows, a stark contrast to the sun-dappled days she had once known. Daniel grew distant, lost in his own thoughts, and Rachel couldn't help but wonder if he had somehow sensed her betrayal. Her guilt grew with every passing moment, a heavy weight that threatened to crush her. On the night of the grand reopening, Rachel stood in the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. The emerald dress Richard had bought her hugged her curves, making her feel like a woman on the cusp of a new life. She took one last look at the photo of her and Daniel on their wedding day before placing it in a drawer, the edges of the frame catching on the wood with a sharp sound that seemed to echo the finality of her decision. The event was a masquerade ball, a perfect setting for their plan. Rachel's eyes searched the room for the familiar faces of the assassins they had hired. They had arrived from out of town, and she had never met them before tonight. Their anonymity made her feel a little less guilty about what was to come. The air was thick with anticipation and the scent of expensive perfumes, all mingling with the faint smell of chlorine from the newly renovated hotel pool. As the clock struck midnight, Rachel slipped away from the party. She found Daniel in their hotel suite, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out the window at the moonlit courtyard below. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I need to talk to you," she whispered, her voice trembling, but before she could say another word, the door burst open. 3 masked figures, each with the cold efficiency of a trained killer, rushed into the room. Rachel's eyes widened in horror as she realized the unthinkable: their plan had been discovered. Daniel, ever the ex-military man, reacted with lightning speed, grabbing a paperweight from the desk and launching it at the closest attacker, shattering his mask and sending him reeling back into the others. The chaos that ensued was a blur of fists and shadows. Rachel watched in horror as Daniel fought with a ferocity she had never seen before. His military training took over, and he disarmed and incapacitated the first 2 assailants with ease. The third, however, was more skilled, or perhaps more desperate. They danced around the room, knocking over lamps and sending shards of glass flying. Rachel cowered in the corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of breaking glass was followed by a heavy thud. Rachel's eyes darted to the floor to find Daniel lying unconscious, the assassin standing over him with a smug grin. But before the killer could deliver the final blow, the door to the suite crashed open, and Richard stumbled in, his own mask askew. Rachel's hope soared. Surely, he had come to save her. But the look in his eyes told a different story. Fear and betrayal melded into one soul-crushing emotion as Rachel watched Richard pull out a gun. "I'm sorry," he murmured, aiming the weapon at Daniel. Rachel's scream was cut short by a hand over her mouth, one of the other assassins silencing her. "It was always going to be this way," Richard continued, his voice cold and emotionless. "Your life insurance was just a bonus. But now, my dear, you're of no use to me." Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief as she realized the depth of his treachery. In a flash of movement that seemed to defy logic, Daniel rolled to the side and grabbed the gun. Rachel's heart stopped as she watched her husband, the love of her life, the man she had plotted against, take control of the situation. With a swiftness that belied his bruised and bloodied state, Daniel overpowered Richard and the remaining assassin, leaving them both unconscious on the floor. Rachel felt a tear slip down her cheek as she watched him dial the police, his voice steady despite the chaos. As the sirens grew louder in the distance, Rachel knew that her world was about to shatter. She had thought she knew what she wanted, but in the end, her greed and lust had led her down a dark path. The plan had been a foolish dream, one that had cost her everything. She took a step towards Daniel, but he turned away, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I can't do this," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I can't stay." Rachel felt a sob rise in her throat, but it was lost in the wail of the sirens. The last thing she saw was his back as he left the room, leaving her to face the consequences alone. The trial was swift and unforgiving. Rachel's infidelity and attempted murder plot were laid bare for the whole town to see. The whispers and stares followed her everywhere, even in her own mind. Richard had been the mastermind, using Rachel's desperation as a pawn in his own twisted game of wealth and power. But the jury saw through his lies, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Rachel received a lighter sentence due to her cooperation, but it was still a fate that felt like a lifetime of hell. The months in the mental hospital were a blur of therapy sessions and medication. Rachel's mind was a minefield of regret and pain. She often found herself staring at the wall, lost in thought, trying to piece together the shards of her shattered life. The therapists tried to help her understand why she had done what she had, but she knew that no amount of talking could ever change the truth. She had been willing to betray the man who had loved her unconditionally. When Rachel was released, she returned to the house on Willow Street, now a prison of her own making. The town had moved on, but the memories remained, taunting her with every step. She had lost Daniel, her home, and her dignity. Rachel wandered through the empty rooms, her heart as hollow as the echo of her footsteps. The house was a silent sentinel to the love and trust she had destroyed. She knew she could never truly escape the darkness she had embraced. One day, while rummaging through the attic, Rachel found a box of Daniel's military awards. His eyes seemed to look back at her from a photo, filled with love and pain. Rachel clutched the medals to her chest, feeling the cold metal against her skin. It was a stark reminder of the man she had failed. With a heavy heart, she vowed to find some semblance of redemption, even if it was just in her own eyes. The road ahead was long and fraught with pain, but she knew she had to start walking it. Rachel took a deep breath and descended the stairs, ready to face the world she had so desperately tried to leave behind. The door to a new chapter of her life was open, but she could never close the book on the horrors of her past. The town had moved on, but Rachel's infamy lingered like a bad odor. She took a job at the local diner, serving coffee and pie to those who knew her story. The whispers followed her, a constant reminder of her treachery. Yet, she never flinched, never turned away. Rachel served with a quiet dignity, hoping that every cup of coffee was a step towards atonement. Her days were filled with the mundane tasks of work and solitude. Rachel avoided the library, the place where she had first met Richard, the man who had promised her the world and delivered only despair. Yet, she couldn't escape the books, their stories of love, loss, and redemption whispering to her from every shelf she passed. Rachel knew she would never find happiness in their pages, but perhaps they could teach her something about forgiving herself. One evening, as Rachel was closing up the diner, a familiar figure stepped through the door. It was Mrs. Jenkins, the librarian from that fateful morning. Rachel's stomach twisted, expecting a lecture or, worse, a cold shoulder. But instead, the woman offered a tentative smile and a small bag of books. "These are for you," she said gently. Rachel looked inside and found tales of strong women overcoming adversity, of finding their way back to themselves. Tears filled her eyes. Was this a sign of acceptance? Of hope? Rachel took the books, feeling their weight in her hands. Maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to the light. As Rachel immersed herself in the stories, she found comfort in the words of the authors who had seen the darkest corners of the human soul and still managed to write of hope. Her therapist encouraged her to journal, to get the toxic thoughts out of her mind and onto paper. Rachel took to it with a fervor, scribbling down her fears and regrets until her hand cramped. The act of writing was cathartic, a way to purge the poison that had been festering inside her. The seasons changed, and Rachel's life took on a new rhythm. She made a few friends at the diner, people who didn't know her history but saw the pain in her eyes. They became her new family, offering her support and a gentle nudge when she needed it. Rachel took up running in the mornings, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet a stark contrast to the hollowness she felt in her heart. It was a solitary activity, but it allowed her to think, to breathe. One chilly morning, Rachel stumbled upon a community garden, the first signs of spring peeking through the frost. It was there she found peace. She started to help, planting seeds and watching them grow into vibrant flowers and vegetables. It was a simple act, but it was the first time in a long time that Rachel felt she had truly contributed to something beautiful. And as she worked the soil, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could grow something beautiful in the wasteland of her life. Years passed, and Rachel continued her quiet journey of penance. The townspeople grew accustomed to her presence, the whispers fading to a dull murmur. Rachel had become a part of the fabric of Elmswood once more, though the scars of her past remained. She never forgot Daniel, the man she had so desperately wanted to leave behind. His memory haunted her, a specter of what might have been. Yet, Rachel knew that she had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. And as she tended to the garden, watching the sun rise over the town she had once plotted to leave, she found a strange form of peace in her solitude. The story of Rachel and Daniel had ended in tragedy, but Rachel's story was far from over. It was a tale of redemption, of learning to live with the weight of her choices, and maybe, just maybe, of finding the strength to love again.